morning of December 21st, 1980, arrived with a lethal atmospheric pressure over the coast of Rhode Island. At Clarendon Court, a 10-acre estate overlooking the Atlantic, the temperature hovered at 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the master suite of the Georgian Revival Mansion, the air was unnaturally still. Sunny von Bülow, the heiress to a fortune then valued at $75 million, the equivalent of $302 million in 2026 purchasing power, lay motionless on the pale marble floor of her bathroom. The marble, a high-density metamorphic rock with high thermal conductivity, acted as a heat sink, rapidly siphoning the remaining warmth from her unconscious form. Her internal body temperature had plummeted to 81 degrees Fahrenheit, a state of profound accidental hypothermia. Her breathing was shallow, a physiological response to the severe hypoglycemic shock induced by an unexplained surge of insulin in her bloodstream. Clarendon Court was not merely a house, it was a limestone fortress designed by architect Horace Trumbauer in 1904. The estate required a staff of 12 to maintain its 21 rooms and manicured grounds. The logistics of the household were governed by a strict hierarchy. Maria Schraulhammer, the German-born maid who had served Sunny for over 20 years, was the first to witness the anomaly. At 9:30 a.m., the routine of the household shattered. The paramedics who arrived noted the contrast between the opulence of the surroundings and the clinical grimness of the scene. The room was filled with the scent of expensive soaps and the metallic tang of medical crisis. Klaus von Bülow, Sunny's husband, stood by with a composure that bordered on the catatonic. His lack of visible agitation was later documented as a key point of suspicion by the Newport Police Department. In 1980, the American economy was reeling from an inflation rate of 13.5%. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had pushed interest rates to 20%, yet inside the gates of Clarendon Court, wealth remained insulated from the volatility of the outside world. The technical cause of Sunny's condition was a mystery. In a healthy individual, insulin regulates glucose levels. In Sunny, it had become a chemical weapon. A single milliliter of U100 insulin contains enough potency to drop blood sugar to fatal levels in minutes. The legal landscape of Rhode Island in 1980 was unprepared for a forensic investigation of this magnitude within the upper echelons of the social register. The primary witnesses were the family members and the domestic staff, a group bound by old-world codes of silence. Sunny's children from her first marriage, Alla and Alexander, were already suspicious. They had noted a similar incident exactly 1 year prior, in December 1979, which they now viewed as a failed rehearsal. The investigation would eventually hinge on a black pharmaceutical bag found in Close's closet, containing Inderal, Valium, and a used syringe. The estate's annual maintenance costs in 1980 exceeded $400,000, roughly $1.6 million today. This included the specialized care for the Indiana limestone exterior and the preservation of 18th century English furniture. As Sunny was transported to Newport Hospital, the machinery of the Gilded Age began to grind to a halt. The me-decade of the 1970s was closing, giving way to a more ruthless era of corporate raids and public scandals. Sunny von Bülow, who had spent her life avoiding the spotlight, was now the centerpiece of a global media frenzy. Her body was a map of chemical trauma, and the primary suspect was the man who had promised to protect her. The medical team worked to stabilize her, but the neurological damage from the prolonged lack of oxygen to the brain was irreversible. She was drifting into a state of permanent unconsciousness. What the world did not yet realize was that this morning was not the start of the tragedy, but the culmination of a decade-long erosion of trust. The clues to her downfall had been scattered across the previous 24 months: missed appointments, slurred speech, and a growing dependence on sedatives. These warning signs had been meticulously catalogued by Maria Schraulhammer, who had attempted to warn the family of Klaus's suspicious behavior. Her warnings had been dismissed as the oversensitivity of a devoted servant. Now, those ignored testimonies would form the basis of the most sensational trial in American history. The cold marble floor had done its work, and the woman who had everything was now a ghost inhabiting a living body. Martha Sharp Crawford was born into a world defined by the industrial dominance of the early 20th century. Her father, George Crawford, was the founder and chairman of Columbia Gas and Electric, a titan of the Appalachian Basin. By 1932, the year of Sonny's birth, the natural gas industry was one of the few sectors of the American economy still expanding despite the Great Depression. Crawford's empire controlled thousands of miles of high-pressure pipelines and drilling rights across millions of acres. When he died in 1935, he left his only daughter a trust fund valued at $100 million. In 2026 terms, this inheritance represents a staggering $2.38 billion placed under a strict legal structure designed to protect the capital from the tax volatility of the New Deal era. Sonny was a billionaire before she could read. Her childhood was a study in nomadic luxury. Under the watchful eye of her mother, Annie Laurie Crawford, Sonny lived in a perpetual rotation of high-end real estate. They occupied a multi-room suite at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan, which in 1935 cost $150 per night, the equivalent of $3,500 today. Her world was populated by governesses, tutors, and private security details. Her education at the Chapin School in New York and St. Timothy's in Maryland was designed to produce a woman of impeccable social standing rather than professional ambition. The curriculum focused on French, art history, and the rigid protocols of the social register. In 1935, the Café Society was replacing the traditional 400 of the Gilded Age, and Sonny was its crowning jewel. She was photographed for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, her likeness used to define the aesthetic of the poor little rich girl. The technical logistics of her wealth were managed by a phalanx of lawyers and accountants at the Chase National Bank. The rule against perpetuities and complex intergenerational trusts ensured that she would never have to touch her principal. However, this financial insulation created a vacuum of agency. Sonny grew up in an environment where every physical need was met by an unseen army of labor. The price of a custom-made Cartier necklace in 1950, which she might buy on a whim, was $25,000, equivalent to $320,000 in 2026. She was a consumer of the finest materials, vicuña wool, Italian silks, and bespoke leather goods. Yet behind this veneer of perfection was a profound isolation. Her father's death had left a void that wealth could not fill, and her mother's overprotectiveness ensured that Sonny remained socially fragile. By the early 1950s, the macroeconomic landscape of the United States was flourishing. The post-war boom had created a new class of millionaires, but Sonny remained part of the old money elite, distinguished by her lack of vulgarity and her immense liquidity. In 1954, her debutante ball at the St. Regis Hotel cost $50,000, roughly $580,000 today. The event featured 1,000 orchids flown in from Hawaii and a 30-piece orchestra. It was here that she was officially presented as the most eligible heiress in the world. Her beauty was often described as radiant, earning her the nickname Sonny. But it was a radiance tempered by a quiet, almost melancholic reserve. She was a prize to be won by the international set, a group of titled but often cash-poor European aristocrats who sought American fortunes as the only way to maintain their crumbling castles. The men who pursued her were experts in the art of the grand tour and the social graces that Sonny had been taught to value. They were masters of the leisure class, operating in a world where the 1950s luxury tax on jewelry and furs was a minor inconvenience. Sonny believed that a title would provide the structure and identity she lacked. She did not realize that her fortune made her a target for the most sophisticated predators in the Atlantic world. These men did not just want her company. They wanted access to the Columbia gas and electric dividends that poured into her accounts with mechanical regularity. As she prepared to enter the international marriage market, she was blissfully unaware that her wealth was a magnet for a specific type of aristocratic rot. The girl who had been raised in the silent hallways of the Waldorf Astoria was about to step onto a global stage. Her first marriage would be a union of American capital and European prestige, a royal mirage that would set the pattern for the rest of her life. She was looking for a protector, but in the high-stakes world of the 1950s jet set, Protection was a commodity that came with a hidden and often deadly interest rate. The stage was set for her first great triumph, which would also be her first great betrayal. The social ascension of Sunny von Bülow reached its formal zenith on July 20th, 1957, with her marriage to Prince Alfred von Auersperg. The ceremony was not merely a romantic union, but a calculated merger of American industrial liquidity and European feudal prestige. Prince Alfred, a descendant of a princely house that once held sovereign rights in the Holy Roman Empire, brought to the marriage a title recognized by the Almanach de Gotha, but very little in the way of tangible assets. In 1957, the Auersperg family, like much of the Austrian nobility, was struggling to maintain their ancestral holdings in the wake of post-war land reforms and the Soviet occupation of Eastern Austria, which had only ended 2 years prior. Alfred's primary profession was that of a socialite and competitive tennis player, a lifestyle that required a level of funding his own family could no longer provide. The couple moved to Salzburg, settling into Schloss Viehhausen, a 15th-century castle. The technical maintenance of such a structure was an immense logistical undertaking. Schloss Viehhausen featured walls of solid limestone and granite over 3 feet thick, which made internal heating a massive engineering challenge. In 1957, Sunny financed the installation of a modern central heating system, a rarity for European castles of the era. The system utilized high-capacity oil burners and miles of copper piping to circulate hot water through cast-iron radiators. The cost of this renovation alone exceeded $150,000, which in 2026 purchasing power is approximately $1.65 million. Every repair, from the restoration of the frescoed ceilings to the slate roofing, was paid for by the dividends of Columbia Gas and Electric. Sunny was not merely a princess. She was the sole benefactor of a decaying aristocratic dream. Macroeconomically, 1957 was a year of profound global shifts. While the United States was enjoying the Eisenhower prosperity, Europe was in the early stages of the European Economic Community, EEC, established by the Treaty of Rome. The world was watching the space race begin with the launch of Sputnik 1, but Sunny's life was focused on a 19th-century social model. She gave birth to 2 children, Annie Laurie, Alla, and Alexander, who held the titles of Princess and Prince von Auersperg. The cost of their nursery staff, including specialized European nannies and private tutors, exceeded the average annual salary of an American doctor at the time. A single season of entertaining at the castle, importing French wines, hiring local catering staff, and maintaining a stable of horses cost upwards of $80,000 or roughly $880,000 in today's currency. The technical failure of the marriage lay in the fundamental disparity of their objectives. Alfred utilized Sunny's capital to fund a lifestyle of hunting trips and international travel, often leaving Sunny isolated in the cold halls of Viehhausen. The royal mirage began to evaporate as Alfred's infidelities became public knowledge within the Salzburg elite. The legal dissolution of a princely marriage in the late 1950s was a complex process involving both civil law and the social codes of the Catholic nobility. When the divorce was finalized in 1965, Sunny retained her wealth but lost the illusion of marital security. She returned to New York with a settlement that saw Alfred receive a significant sum to maintain his own lifestyle, a price Sunny was willing to pay to regain her independence. She was 33 years old, an extremely wealthy divorcee with 2 children, and a target for a more sophisticated class of operator. The transition from the Austrian Alps back to the Fifth Avenue social circuit required a new strategy. Sunny was no longer a naive heiress. She was a woman seeking a partner who could manage the immense administrative burden of her estate. It was during this period of vulnerability that she was introduced to Klaus von Bülow. Klaus was not a prince, but he possessed a weapon more effective than a title. He was a high-level corporate adjutant to the world's richest man. He understood the movement of global capital and the psychology of the ultra-wealthy. While Prince Alfred had been a simple playboy, Klaus was a strategist. He observed Sunny not as a romantic interest, but as an opportunity for total career consolidation. Klaus Borch von Bülow entered Sonny's life with a resume that was a masterpiece of social and professional engineering. Born in Denmark as Claus Borsch, he had added the von Bülow to his name to capitalize on his mother's aristocratic German lineage, despite the family's decline into middle-class professional status. By the time he met Sonny in the mid-1960s, Claus had spent nearly a decade as the personal assistant and right-hand man to J. Paul Getty. Working for Getty provided Claus with a technical education in the management of absolute wealth. He was responsible for Getty's logistical movements, social scheduling, and delicate negotiations with oil ministers and tax authorities. Claus understood the Getty philosophy. Wealth was a tool for control, and every expense must serve a structural purpose. When Claus and Sonny married on June 6, 1966, the financial landscape was shifting. The U.S. was deeply embroiled in the Vietnam War, and the Great Society programs were expanding the federal budget. Inflation was beginning its upward climb, making the management of liquid assets more critical than ever. Claus immediately took control of Sonny's domestic economy. His first major strategic move was the purchase of Clarendon Court in Newport for $1.2 million. In 2026, this $4 million investment was considered a bargain for a property of such architectural significance. The house, designed by Horace Trumbauer, was a replica of an 18th century English country house. It was constructed of Indiana limestone, with a slate roof, and featured a grand staircase modeled after the one at the Petit Trianon in Versailles. Claus's management of Clarendon Court was an exercise in high-efficiency domesticity. He oversaw the technical staff with the precision of a corporate manager. He negotiated the contracts for the estate's maintenance, from the complex boiler systems required to heat the 21-room structure to the landscaping of the 10-acre grounds. Under his direction, Sonny's annual expenditures were streamlined, not to save money, but to ensure that the wealth was used to create a frictionless environment for her. However, this frictionless life came at the cost of Sonny's social autonomy. Claus became the gatekeeper. Every invitation, every phone call, and every staff hire went through him. He moved her away from her mother's influence and concentrated her life within the walls of Clarendon Court. The architecture of the house itself facilitated this isolation. The master suite was a separate wing, accessible only through a series of dressing rooms and heavy doors. Technically, the house functioned as a gilded panopticon where Claus could monitor Sonny's movements and her growing reliance on various substances. In 1966, the pharmaceutical industry was rapidly expanding, and the use of barbiturates and sedatives was common among the elite. Claus, with his background in managing Getty's private needs, was familiar with the medicalization of the wealthy. He ensured that Sonny had access to a rotating cast of private doctors who would prescribe medications without questioning her lifestyle. By 1970, Sonny's primary activity was staying in bed, while Claus managed the Bülow brand in New York and Newport. The secondary characters in this period included figures like J. Paul Getty himself, who viewed Claus's marriage as a successful retirement into the upper class, and Sonny's mother, Annie Laurie, who began to view her son-in-law with increasing distrust. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the strategy seemed to be working perfectly. Claus had transitioned from an employee to a master of a great house. He had a beautiful wife, 2 stepchildren with royal titles, and a daughter of his own, Cosima. But the 1970s would bring the Nixon shock and the end of the gold standard, leading to a decade of economic chaos. In the private world of Clarendon Court, a different kind of instability was brewing. Claus was no longer content with being the manager. He wanted to be the heir. He began to explore the legal mechanisms of Sonny's trusts, looking for the technical loopholes that would allow him to bypass her children. Claus von Bülow was a man of cold calculations, but he had overlooked one technical detail in his grand design. While he had secured the wife and the estate, he had failed to account for the unwavering loyalty of the woman who saw everything, the maid, Maria Schreilhammer. As Sonny's health began its first visible decline under a haze of prescribed chemicals, Maria began to document the anomalies. The web was nearly complete, but the first thread was about to snap. Clarendon Court was not merely a residence, it was a limestone-clad fortress of the Gilded Age, designed to withstand both the Atlantic gales and the scrutiny of the lower classes. Architect Horace Trumbauer, known as the architect of the ultra-rich, utilized a high-density Indiana limestone for the exterior, a material chosen for its compressive strength of 4,000 psi and its ability to develop a protective patina against the corrosive salt air of Newport. The mansion, a 21-room Neo-Palladian masterpiece, required a logistical support system comparable to a small luxury hotel. The annual payroll for the 12-person staff, ranging from the butler and chef to the specialized laundresses required to handle Sonny's collection of Belgian linens, exceeded $250,000 in 1975. In 2026 purchasing power, this operational overhead represents an annual expenditure of $1.52 million just to maintain the status quo. The technical heart of the estate was its heating and climate control system. Maintaining a constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit across 20,000 square feet of high-ceilinged rooms required massive cast-iron boilers that consumed thousands of gallons of heating oil. Paradoxically, while the 1973 oil crisis, triggered by the OPEC embargo, sent the global economy into a tailspin and forced the average American into miles-long gas lines, the heiress to the Columbia Gas and Electric fortune remained insulated. Her wealth, derived from the very energy sector that was strangling the middle class, ensured that the internal climate of Clarendon Court never wavered. The macroeconomic stagflation of the mid-70s, where unemployment hit 9% and inflation hovered at 12%, was an invisible phantom outside the wrought iron gates. For Sonny, the gilded lifestyle meant a total detachment from the mechanical realities of survival. Her daily routine was a study in high-end stasis. Sonny often remained in the master suite until late afternoon. This suite was a masterpiece of specialized interior design, featuring sound-dampening silk wall coverings and custom-milled moldings. Her bed, a bespoke piece of furniture, was draped in Port-Halt linens, a brand where a single set of sheets in 1975 cost $800, equivalent to $4,950 today. The logistics of her wardrobe were equally complex. Sonny's collection of Givenchy and Balenciaga couture required a temperature-controlled cedar closet system to prevent the degradation of organic fibers. Her car fleet was anchored by a 1970 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, a vehicle featuring a 6.75-liter V8 engine and a revolutionary high-pressure hydraulic system licensed from Citroën, which ensured a ride so smooth it was described as isolation from the road itself. This $19,000 vehicle, roughly $165,000 in 2026, was rarely driven by Sonny. It served as a mobile extension of her domestic enclosure. Secondary characters in this ecosystem included the Newport rivals, such as the Astors and the Vanderbilts, whose fading influence made them increasingly critical of the Bülow intrusion. While the old guard viewed Klaus as a parvenu, they could not ignore the sheer scale of the Bülows' entertaining. The 1978 Christmas party at Clarendon Court was an archival curiosity of excess. The 10-foot Nordmann fir tree was decorated with antique glass ornaments, and the catering included beluga caviar, which in 1978 cost $150 per 14-ounce tin, approximately $750 today. Yet behind the beluga and the crystal, Sonny was retreating into a pharmaceutical fog. Her nightstand was a chemical laboratory, Seconal for sleep, Valium for anxiety, and Dexedrine for alertness. This was the poor little rich girl syndrome digitized for the late 20th century. Her isolation was not just physical, it was biochemical. Klaus managed the staff and the social calendar, effectively becoming the chief operating officer of a woman who was slowly losing interest in being conscious. As the decade drew to a close, the technical maintenance of Sonny's image became harder to sustain. The salt air that Trumbauer's limestone resisted was nothing compared to the internal rot of the marriage. The archival record shows a woman who was increasingly fragile, a euphemism used by the Newport elite to describe her growing dependence on sedatives and sweets. While the 1979 Iranian Revolution caused another spike in energy prices, further padding Sunny's trust funds, she was becoming a prisoner of her own comfort. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a high-maintenance mausoleum. The very luxuries designed to serve her were now the barriers that prevented anyone from seeing her true condition. To the external observer in the late 1970s, Klaus and Sunny von Bülow were the definitive power couple of the Manhattan-Newport axis. Their social mask was constructed with the precision of a theatrical production. The primary stage for this performance was the Metropolitan Opera House at Lincoln Center. As grand patrons, they occupied a Tier 1 box, a social position that in 1977 required a cumulative donation exceeding $100,000, or roughly $540,000 in 2026. The technical etiquette of the Met was a rigid hierarchy where seat placement and the timing of one's arrival signaled precise levels of liquidity and influence. Klaus, always in bespoke evening wear from Savile Row, costing $2,500 per suit or $13,500 today, played the role of the attentive, aristocratic consort. Sunny, draped in Givenchy silk and wearing the Crawford diamonds, was the silent, radiant center of the tableau. However, the macro context of the era was one of radical social upheaval that the Bülows chose to ignore. The late 70s saw the rise of the paparazzi culture, led by photographers like Ron Galella, who transformed private elite life into public commodity. While the sexual revolution and the feminist movement were reconfiguring the American family, Klaus and Sunny maintained a regressive, almost Edwardian domestic structure. This social mask was essential for Klaus's survival. Without the aura of a stable marriage to a Crawford heiress, his standing in the New York business world, where he served on various prestigious boards, would evaporate. He was a man whose entire net worth was tied to the perception of his wife's devotion. The reality behind the mask was a cold war of neglect and infidelity. By 1978, Klaus had begun a serious affair with Alexandra Isles, a socialite and actress on the Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows. The logistics of this double life were funded by Sunny's capital. Klaus maintained a private apartment in New York, ostensibly for business, where he hosted Isles. In 2026 terms, the rental for such a pied-à-terre in the Upper East Side would exceed $15,000 a month. Isles, representing a more modern, career-oriented woman, provided a sharp contrast to Sunny's reclusive traditionalism. She eventually issued Klaus an ultimatum: obtain a divorce or end the relationship. But Klaus faced a technical financial barrier. Sunny's prenuptial and trust structures, designed by the sharp Crawford lawyers in the 1930s, ensured that in the event of a divorce, Klaus would leave with virtually nothing. To maintain his lifestyle, Sunny had to remain his wife or become his widow. The social mask also involved a dangerous medical charade. Klaus frequently administered what he termed vitamin injections to Sunny. Technically, these were purported to be B12 shots, a common fad among the 1970s elite, to combat fatigue. However, archival testimony from the domestic staff later revealed a more sinister chemistry. The syringes Klaus handled were often concealed. In the late 70s, medical oversight for private home care was virtually non-existent for the ultra-wealthy. A doctor could be summoned to Clarendon Court, paid a premium fee, roughly $500 for a house call or $2,700 today, and asked to provide prescriptions without a rigorous diagnostic process. This boutique medicine allowed Klaus to curate Sunny's chemical environment under the guise of caregiving. The children, Alla and Alexander von Auersperg, were the first to see the cracks in the facade. As they matured into their late teens, they observed their stepfather's growing coldness and their mother's inexplicable periods of stupor. They were heirs to the Auersperg title, but were financially dependent on their mother's Crawford trusts. The technicality of Sunny's will meant that if she died, the bulk of the $75 million fortune would pass to her children, but Klaus would inherit Clarendon Court and a life interest in a multi-million-dollar trust. The tension between the stepfather and the stepchildren was a micro-reflection of the era's intergenerational conflicts. By 1979, the mask was slipping. The perfect couple was a fiction sustained only by the inertia of wealth and the silence of a staff that was paid to look the other way. The stage was set for the first accident, a rehearsal for the marble morning that would change everything. By 1980, the social landscape of Newport, Rhode Island was undergoing a tectonic shift, moving from a private playground for the Gilded Age elite to a public theater of the grotesque. The city itself was a relic of late 19th century hypercapitalism, built on the foundations of the summer cottage era. Architecture here was a weapon of social positioning. The Breakers, the Elms, and Clarendon Court were not merely houses. They were limestone and granite manifestations of the 1890s wealth that had survived the Great Depression and the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913. However, the maintenance of these structures in the late 1970s was becoming technically prohibitive. The Indiana limestone used in Clarendon Court's construction required specialized chemical cleaning to remove the sulfuric acid deposits caused by modern industrial pollution, a process costing upwards of $100,000 per treatment in 1980, or approximately $402,000 in 2026 purchasing power. The local property tax assessments on Bellevue Avenue estates were skyrocketing as the city of Newport transitioned from a seasonal colony to a year-round tourist destination. In 1980, a mansion like Clarendon Court carried an annual tax liability that exceeded the total lifetime earnings of an average American blue-collar worker. Macroeconomically, 1980 was a year of profound instability. The United States was trapped in stagflation, the simultaneous occurrence of stagnant economic growth and high inflation. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, had surged by 13.5%, and the prime interest rate peaked at an unprecedented 21.5% in December of that year. While the rest of the nation struggled with the collapse of the automotive industry in Detroit and the decline of the steel belt, Sonny von Bülow's wealth remained tethered to the energy sector. Her trusts, rooted in the 1935 George Crawford estate, were beneficiaries of the 1979 energy crisis. As oil prices tripled following the Iranian Revolution, the dividends flowing into Sonny's accounts reached record highs. Her net worth was self-replicating, growing even as she retreated into isolation. Yet this wealth existed in a vacuum. The legal environment of Rhode Island was shifting. The era of gentleman's law, where the indiscretions of the Newport elite were handled privately by family attorneys and local sheriffs, was ending. A new generation of aggressive prosecutors, exemplified by Rhode Island Attorney General Dennis Roberts II, was looking to prove that the law applied even to those behind the wrought iron gates of Bellevue Avenue. Sonny von Bülow was a chronological anachronism. She maintained a lifestyle modeled on the pre-war social registers in a decade defined by the rise of disco, the birth of 24-hour news cycles, CNN had launched in June 1980, and a growing public appetite for the rich and famous. The debutante balls of 1980, which once served as the primary mechanism for social stratification, were now being critiqued by a more cynical media. A mid-tier debutante ball in 1980 cost roughly $30,000, equivalent to $120,000 today, an expense increasingly viewed as a vulgar display of obsolescence. Sonny's peers were figures like Janet Auchincloss, the mother of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who represented the final guard of the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ascendancy. These families operated under a strict code of omerta regarding family scandals, substance abuse, and domestic violence. They viewed the burgeoning paparazzi culture, led by figures who sold photos to tabloids for $5,000 a shot, $20,000 today, with a mixture of terror and disgust. Sonny's isolation was her defense mechanism against a world that no longer respected her privacy. The technical security of Clarendon Court was also outdated. In 1980, high-end residential security systems relied on hardwired perimeter sensors and rudimentary CCTV cameras that recorded on bulky VHS tapes. There was no digital encryption, no motion-sensing lasers, and no cellular backups. The primary security was human, a gatekeeper, and a domestic staff. This human element was the vulnerability Klaus von Bülow exploited. He understood the architecture of deference, where servants were trained to be invisible and non-interventionist. The logistics of the house allowed Klaus to move through the wings of the mansion without being logged by any electronic system. He was the administrator of a fortress that had no internal surveillance. This lack of technical oversight provided the perfect laboratory for a chemical crime. As the winter of 1980 approached, the social shadows of Newport were lengthening, and the Gilded Age was about to meet the forensic reality of the late 20th century. The forensic core of the von Bülow mystery is contained within a single object, a black vinyl pharmaceutical bag. In the hierarchy of evidence, this bag represents the transition from circumstantial suspicion to criminal intent. The shadow first deepened exactly 1 year before the final collapse, on December 27, 1979. Sunny had fallen into her first unexplained coma after a night of heavy drinking and sedative use. She had been found in a state of respiratory distress with her blood sugar levels plummeting to 20 mg/dL, a level typically associated with a massive overdose of insulin. The medical term for this is hyperinsulinemic hypoglycemia. In 1979, the technical testing for insulin levels was less sophisticated than today. Doctors often struggled to distinguish between endogenous insulin produced by the body and exogenous insulin injected from an external source. Sunny survived this first episode, but it served as a physiological rehearsal for the year to follow. The secondary character who would change the course of history was Maria Schrallhammer, Sunny's German-born lady's maid. Maria was a product of the rigorous post-war European domestic training system, where a maid's duty was not just to clean, but to maintain the physical and biological integrity of her employer. Maria's background in a structured, disciplined environment made her a meticulous observer of detail. In early 1980, while cleaning Klaus's dressing room, a space constructed with mahogany cabinetry and hidden compartments, she discovered the black bag. Its contents were a technical inventory of a slow assassination. A bottle of isophane insulin, NPH, a vial of regular insulin, several 1cc tuberculin syringes with 26-gauge needles, and a collection of sedative pills, including Valium and Inderal. In 1980, insulin was not the synthetic analog version used today. It was primarily bovine or porcine insulin, extracted from the pancreases of slaughtered cows and pigs. It was a potent biological drug that, if injected into a non-diabetic, would force the body's cells to absorb glucose until the brain was starved of energy, leading to permanent neurological death. The logistics of Klaus von Bülow's life in 1980 were dictated by a lethal timeline. He was under immense pressure from his mistress, Alexandra Iles. Iles was a woman of significant social standing herself, the daughter of a Danish diplomat, and a fixture of the New York stage. She was not a mere other woman, but a social peer who demanded legitimacy. By late 1980, she had issued Klaus an ultimatum. He had to secure a divorce and a financial future, or she would end the affair. However, the macro context of Klaus's finances made divorce a form of social suicide. Under the terms of the Crawford Trusts, a divorce would leave him with a settlement of less than $2 million. An amount that, while seemingly large, would not support the $500,000 a year lifestyle required to remain in the upper echelons of the international jet set. In 2026 terms, Klaus was looking at a poverty of $8 million in capital, which would generate only $320,000 in annual income, insufficient to maintain even the staff of a New York apartment. Murder was the only technical solution that offered a return on investment. The black bag remained a hidden variable throughout 1980. Maria Schrallhammer, despite her suspicions, was trapped by the social codes of her era. To accuse the master of the house of attempted murder was an act of social treason. She did, however, show the bag to Sunny's daughter, Alla, and to the family's private physician, Dr. Richard Stock. In a profound failure of professional skepticism, Dr. Stock dismissed the bag as Klaus's personal business, assuming that a man of his standing must have a legitimate, albeit private, medical reason for possessing such items. This was the elite blindness of 1980, the belief that extreme wealth was a proxy for moral character. Klaus continued to carry the bag in his luggage during their travels between New York and Newport. He was refining the chemistry of the coma, experimenting with dosages that would incapacitate Sunny without immediately killing her, allowing him to claim she was merely depressed or drunk. The archive curiosities of the 1980 pharmaceutical world reveal how easy it was for a man like Klaus to procure these tools. Insulin was not a controlled substance in the same way as narcotics. It could be purchased at most pharmacies without a verified prescription if the buyer claimed it was for a family member. Syringes, too, were easily accessible. Klaus used his Getty Oil legal training to ensure that he never left a paper trail. He didn't buy the drugs in Newport or Manhattan. He likely procured them during his frequent trips to London or through obscure medical supply channels. As December 1980 approached, the inventory of the black bag was complete. The mistress was waiting. The trusts were ripe for inheritance, and the wife was increasingly sedated. The shadow was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical presence in the master bedroom of Clarendon Court, waiting for the winter solstice. The legal proceedings against Klaus von Bülow represented a paradigm shift in American jurisprudence, marking the moment when high-stakes criminal defense became a televised, multidisciplinary engineering project. Following the second coma of Sunny von Bülow in December 1980, the Rhode Island State Police initiated a forensic audit of the evidence provided by the Auersperg children and their private investigator, Richard Koo. Koo, a former Manhattan district attorney, utilized a tactical approach to the investigation that bypassed the slower public channels, securing the black bag and its chemical contents before they could be destroyed. The primary legal challenge in 1982 was the interpretation of the radioimmunoassay (RIA) results. This technical procedure, developed by Roslyn Yallo and Solomon Burson, was designed to measure minute concentrations of insulin in the blood. In 1982, the prosecution argued that Sunny's insulin level of 450 microunits per milliliter, more than 10 times the normal physiological range, was irrefutable proof of exogenous injection. The first trial in Newport was a masterpiece of social theater, presided over by Judge Thomas Needham. The macroeconomic context of 1982 was one of Reaganomics and the burgeoning greed is good culture. Yet the jury was composed of working-class Rhode Islanders who viewed the $75 million Crawford fortune with a mixture of awe and resentment. The prosecution, led by Stephen Familietti, constructed a narrative of the fortune hunter who sought to trade his wife's life for a life of luxury with his mistress, Alexandra Isles. The logistics of the trial were immense. It lasted 9 weeks and cost the state of Rhode Island over $250,000, while the defense expenditures reached $1 million, equivalent to $445 million in 2026 purchasing power. Klaus was convicted on 2 counts of attempted murder and sentenced to 30 years. The conviction seemed to signal the end of the Bülow era as he was released on a $1 million bail, the highest in the state's history, funded by his socialite friends and the liquid remains of his own assets. The technical pivot occurred when Klaus hired Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor known for his mastery of the appellate strategy. Dershowitz did not merely argue the facts. He attacked the methodology of the investigation. He argued that the private search of the black bag violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Fourth Amendment regarding illegal search and seizure. Furthermore, he utilized a medical counteroffensive, hiring a team of 9 world-class specialists in endocrinology and forensic pathology to re-examine Sunny's medical history. They discovered a technicality. The insulin tests used in the first trial did not distinguish between insulin and the pro-insulin produced by the body during a reactive hypoglycemic episode. In the macro context of the mid-80s, the reasonable doubt standard was being redefined by the use of expert witnesses who could neutralize any scientific claim made by the state. The second trial in 1985 featured a new secondary character who would dominate the media landscape: Andrea Reynolds, Klaus's new socialite girlfriend and a Hungarian refugee with a fierce tactical mind. Reynolds managed the Bülow PR machine, ensuring that Klaus appeared not as a killer, but as a victim of a vengeful family and an incompetent medical establishment. The cost of this second legal defense was staggering, exceeding $2 million, or roughly $8.9 million today. Dershowitz's team introduced evidence of Sunny's aspirin-induced gastric bleeding and her heavy consumption of eggnog, a high-sugar, high-fat liquid that could trigger a massive insulin spike in a person with reactive hypoglycemia. The archival record shows that the defense also utilized private investigators to dig into the backgrounds of the state's witnesses, creating a climate of character assassination that overshadowed the physical evidence. In June 1985, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. The legal engineering had worked. The Harvardization of the defense had created enough technical noise to drown out the circumstantial evidence of the black bag and the motive of the mistress. Klaus was free, but the cost was the total destruction of the family unit. The Auersperg children immediately launched a $56 million civil suit against him, the equivalent of $249 million in 2026. This legal maneuver was designed to prevent Klaus from ever profiting from Sunny's death. Under the pressure of this civil litigation, a settlement was eventually reached. Klaus agreed to a divorce, renounced all claims to Sunny's estate and his daughter Cosima's inheritance, and moved to London to live in permanent, well-funded exile. The law had provided a verdict, but it had not provided the truth. While the legal battles raged in the 1980s, the physical reality of Sunny von Bülow was reduced to a set of biological maintenance protocols at the Mary Manning Walsh Nursing Home in Manhattan. Sunny was in a state defined by neurology as a persistent vegetative state, PVS. In this condition, the brainstem remains functional, regulating involuntary actions like heart rate and breathing, but the cerebral cortex, the seat of thought, memory, and consciousness, is functionally dead due to prolonged hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Wiedemann. For 28 years, the woman who once occupied the center of the Newport social world was confined to a high-density specialized mattress designed to prevent decubitus ulcers, pressure sores caused by the weight of a sedentary body on bony prominences. The mattress utilized an alternating pressure system to stimulate blood flow, a technical necessity for a patient who cannot shift their own weight. The logistics of Sunny's care were a marvel of modern medical expenditure. She occupied a private, 3-room suite that was modified to look more like a luxury apartment than a hospital ward, decorated with her own furniture and artwork to maintain a semblance of her former life. The staff-to-patient ratio was 3-to-1. A team of private nurses paid $60 per hour in 1990, approximately $180 per hour in 2026 terms, provided 24-hour monitoring. Her nutrition was delivered via a percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, PEG tube, a technical innovation of the early 1980s that allowed a feeding tube to be inserted directly into the stomach through the abdominal wall. This bypassed the discomfort and infection risks of the older nasogastric tubes. Every 6 hours, a nutrient-dense liquid formula was pumped into her system, maintaining her weight and organ function with mechanical precision. The annual cost of this gilded coma exceeded $500,000 in the 1990s, reaching over $1.5 million per year in the final decade of her life. In total, the Crawford estate spent over $35 million, equivalent to $155 million in 2026, just to maintain the biological integrity of a woman who could not perceive it. Macroeconomically, Sunny's 28-year coma spanned the rise and fall of several global cycles, from the Black Monday crash of 1987 to the dot-com bubble and the 9/11 attacks. While the world outside her window changed irrevocably, Sunny's environment was a temperature-controlled 72 degrees, silent except for the rhythmic hum of her feeding pump and the occasional sound of classical music played by her nurses. Her children, Alla and Alexander, remained her primary guardians, overseeing the Sunny von Bülow National Victim Advocacy Center, which they founded with $5 million of her fortune to help families of other crime victims. This secondary legacy was a direct reaction to the legal injustice they felt they had suffered during Klaus's acquittal. They visited her regularly, maintaining a vigil that lasted longer than the Gilded Age itself. The archival curiosities of her long-term care reveal the tragic irony of her wealth. Her hair was regularly styled, her nails manicured, and her skin treated with expensive moisturizers to prevent the cracking associated with long-term immobilization. Yet the physics of the human body are unforgiving. Without voluntary movement, the tendons in her limbs began to shorten, a condition known as contractures, requiring physical therapists to manually stretch her joints several times a week to prevent her body from curling into a permanent fetal position. In the late 1990s, the medical debate around PVS was intensified by the public case of Terry Schiavo, which brought the right to die and living will discussions to the forefront of American politics. Sunny, however, had no living will. Because her wealth was so vast and the legal battles over her estate so complex, the decision to unplug her was never an option. Her body had become a legal and financial entity that had to be preserved at all costs. By the early 2000s, Sunny von Bülow had become a living ghost, a name synonymous with a bygone era of Newport excess and the dark side of the American dream. Her muscles had atrophied to the point where she weighed less than 100 pounds. Her immune system, once robust, was now entirely dependent on a sterile environment and aggressive antibiotic treatments for any minor infection. The woman who had been born into the age of gas was now a ward of the age of biotechnology. We know to you she was a biological machine, sustained by the very dividends her father had secured nearly a century before. The longest sleep was not a rest, but a technical stalemate between the desire to let go and the legal obligation to keep a multi-million-dollar asset functional. On the morning of December 6, 2008, the biological countdown that had been ticking in silence for 28 years reached its 0 hour. Sunny von Bülow died at the Mary Manning Walsh Nursing Home in Manhattan at the age of 76. The technical cause of death was cited as secondary complications from her decades-long persistent vegetative state, specifically a final systemic collapse of the renal and respiratory systems. In a person immobilized for nearly 3 decades, the body undergoes a process of atrophic calcification. The lungs, having lost their elasticity from lack of voluntary expansion, become increasingly susceptible to fluid accumulation. Her final exit was a quiet mechanical failure, a winding down of the highly expensive life support systems that had maintained her biological shell since 1980. The woman who had spent more than 1/3 of her life in a state of suspended animation was finally released from the clinical precision of her $1.5 million per year medical suite. The macroeconomic context of her death was one of global catastrophe. As Sunny drew her final breaths, the world outside was experiencing the Great Recession of 2008. The collapse of Lehman Brothers only months earlier had triggered a global liquidity crisis that wiped out nearly $10 trillion in global wealth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was fluctuating with a volatility not seen since the Great Depression of her birth year. Yet the Crawford Trust, managed with a conservative 19th century focus on energy and utilities, remained largely solvent. While the new money of the 2000s evaporated in the subprime mortgage meltdown, the old money of the gas king proved its structural resilience. Even in death, Sunny was a testament to the durability of industrial capital. The funeral logistics were a study in understated elite tradition. She was buried in a private ceremony at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York, a resting place she shared with other titans of the Gilded Age, including Andrew Carnegie and William Rockefeller. The cost of a private plot and perpetual care in such a location in 2008 was approximately $75,000, equivalent to $112,000 in 2026 purchasing power. Secondary characters at her bedside were her children, Alla and Alexander, who had spent their entire adult lives as guardians of a mother who did not know them. Their presence was a final act of the loyalty that had fueled their 30-year legal crusade against their stepfather. Conspicuously absent was Klaus von Bülow. By 2008, Klaus was living in a flat in London's South Kensington, an area where a 2-bedroom apartment carried a rental value of $8,000 per month, or roughly $12,000 today. He had become a fixture of the London social scene, writing theatre reviews and attending operas. his infamy having transitioned into a form of dark celebrity. The archival curiosities of the day included a brief clinical obituary in the New York Times, which carefully avoided the word murder but detailed every technicality of the trials. The public fascination with the case had been reignited by the film Reversal of Fortune. Yet for the family, the death was not a cinematic event, but the closing of a heavy, lead-lined door. The technical legacy of her medical journey remains a landmark in bioethics. Sunny was one of the longest surviving PVS patients in history. Her case cited in medical journals regarding the long-term effects of gastrostomy-based nutrition and the ethics of end-of-life care for the ultra-wealthy. Because her estate was so vast, there was never a financial incentive for her children to unplug her. A stark contrast to the thousands of middle-class families who face such decisions based on the exhaustion of insurance limits. Her body was a laboratory for the intersection of extreme wealth and medical technology. As the soil was placed over her casket in Sleepy Hollow, the legal existence of Sunny von Bülow was finalized, but the distribution of her assets was only just beginning. The Crawford fortune, which had been locked in a defensive posture for 3 decades, was about to be liquidated and dispersed. The mystery of that December morning in 1980 was never solved by a confession. Klaus von Bülow survived his wife by 11 years, dying in 2019 at the age of 92. He took the truth of the black bag to his grave, leaving behind only the echoes of a defense strategy that had prioritized reasonable doubt over biological reality. Sunny's death was the final act of a play where the protagonist had been offstage for the entire second and third acts. The cycle that began on a cold marble floor in Newport had ended in a quiet room in Manhattan, but the ruins of the empire she left behind were still smoldering. The dissolution of the Sunny von Bülow estate marked the final decommissioning of a Gilded Age lifestyle. Following her death, the primary logistical task was the liquidation of Clarendon Court. In 2012, the 10-acre Newport estate was sold for $13.1 million, a figure that, when adjusted to 2026 purchasing power, represents approximately $18.5 million. This valuation was considered a distressed price given the home's history and the specialized maintenance required for its limestone and slate structure. The buyer, a private equity billionaire, initiated a total renovation to strip the mansion of its 1980s aesthetic, effectively erasing the physical environment of Sunny's collapse. The auction of her personal effects at Sotheby's and Christie's provided an archival window into her private world. Her jewelry collection, including a Van Cleef & Arpels diamond and emerald suite, sold for millions, with the proceeds directed toward the charitable trusts she had established in her will. The macro context of her legacy is defined by the Sunny von Bülow National Victim Advocacy Center. Funded with an initial endowment of $5 million, roughly $22 million in 2026, the center transformed her personal tragedy into a structural legal force. It pioneered the use of victim impact statements in American courts, a technical procedural change that shifted the balance of power during sentencing. This was the Auersperg children's revenge against the legal system that had acquitted their stepfather. They spent their mother's money to ensure that future Klaus von Bülows would face a more aggressive and victim-oriented prosecution. The center's influence reached into federal legislation, shaping the Crime Victims' Rights Act of 2004. Sunny's wealth, which Klaus had allegedly sought to control, ended up funding the very mechanisms designed to empower the families of those she left behind. Secondary characters in the legacy include her grandchildren, who inherited the remnants of the Auersperg titles, but lived lives significantly more private than their grandmother. The Bülow curse became a localized legend in Newport, a cautionary tale told to tourists on the cliff walk that passes behind the mansion. The archive curiosities include the fact that Clarendon Court is often cited in architectural surveys as one of the last pure examples of Trumbauer's neoclassicism, but it is forever tainted by its association with the longest sleep. Renault, the internal logistics of the Crawford Trust were finally settled in the late 2010s, with the remaining capital distributed among several foundations focused on neurological research and end-of-life ethics. A final irony for a woman whose own neurological state had been a matter of public debate for decades. Technically, the von Bülow case remains a staple of first-year law and forensic medicine curricula. It is studied not for its resolution, but for its failure. It serves as the definitive example of how elite blindness and high-priced legal engineering can neutralize forensic evidence. The insulin test results that convicted Klaus in the first trial and acquitted him in the second are still used to teach the limitations of biochemical assays in criminal courts. The legacy is one of ambiguity. The truth was buried not just in the cemetery at Sleepy Hollow, but under layers of appellate briefs, expert testimonies, and a public relations campaign that transformed a suspected murderer into a socialite emeritus. The Crawford fortune was the fuel for this ambiguity, proving that in the American legal system, the cost of truth is often higher than the price of a Newport mansion. The final image of the Sonny von Bülow story is not one of wealth, but of the void that wealth creates. Clarendon Court stands today as a modernized trophy, its limestone walls cleaned of the salt and the secrets of the 1980s. The gardens are still manicured, and the Atlantic still beats against the cliffs with the same rhythmic indifference it showed on the December morning. But the Princesa da Era de Ouro is gone, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of a life lived in a gilded cage. For Sonny von Bülow, the gold was never a currency for happiness. It was the metal precious with which her husband, or her destiny, forged the bars of her final, silent enclosure.